Hi, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to the Center for Archival Futures, also known as CAFE, here at the University of Maryland. It's a research center focused on archives and digital curation, very broadly conceived. My name is Katrina Fenlon. I'm an assistant professor here, and this is our flagship talk series, First Wednesdays, at which we host speakers who are at the cutting edge of archives and digital curation, research, and practice in a variety of settings. And you can find our previous events at the CAFE events page link, which I am just putting into the chat right now. So before we begin, I want to give our land and slavery acknowledgement. Today, we're beaming in from College Park, Maryland, which is located on the ancestral territories of the Piscataway, Nacotchtank, and their indigenous kin and neighbors. As members of the University of Maryland, we acknowledge, as a land-grant university, the 202,000 acres of stolen indigenous land taken and distributed to the university under the Morrill Act in 1862. We want to acknowledge the separation that these and many other acts of colonialism, assimilation, and genocide, which include archival collecting, generate between indigenous peoples and their homelands. We honor the continued power and resilience of indigenous communities and nations, and we celebrate the collaborative and decolonizing work now taking place in our collections and institutions. And we want to further acknowledge the University of Maryland's connections to slavery and to generations of racialized trauma rooted in the institution. As a member college of the University Studying Slavery Consortium, the University of Maryland has undertaken the 1856 Project, which is committed to investigating and illuminating these histories. That project endeavors to lay a path toward restorative history, allowing the institution to engage in the work of moral accountability and reconciliation. And through this work, the university recommits itself to creating equitable, inclusive, and diverse curriculum spaces. As a reminder to all the students in our audience, we have a new tradition in CAFE following the norms at many academic institutions and traditional seminars of offering the first opportunity for questions in our audience to students. So for those who are students here, especially our MLIS students, our Student Archivists of Maryland, please do prepare your questions. You're welcome to ask them in the chat after the talk or by raising your hand to unmute after the talk. So I am excited to see such a full house for such an exciting guest today. Dr. Trevor Owens, the first Chief Research Officer at the American Institute of Physics, leading a new interdisciplinary research center of librarians, archivists, historians, social scientists focused on the interplay of physical sciences, public policy, and disciplinary cultures. Dr. Owens previously served as the Director of Digital Services at the Library of Congress and as a Senior Program Officer and Associate Deputy Director for Libraries at the Institute of Museum and Library Services. He has authored 4 books, including one that came out just this year called After Disruption, A Future for Cultural Memory, published by the University of Michigan Press. I also cite and teach very frequently and enthusiastically with his book on the theory and craft of digital preservation. So a very hearty welcome to Dr. Trevor Owens speaking about From Collections to Connections, Centering Belonging in Archival Futures.
Thank you so much. I am thrilled to have what a kind and generous introduction. So you're going to make me blush, but much appreciated. And I'm just delighted to have this chance to connect with the CAFE community. And as I'll get into several of the things that my experience teaching for UMD, for the College of Information as an adjunct at a few different points in time, has really been a driver for some of my scholarship too. So that's a point I'll hit on. And then the other thing I should underscore at the get-go is that the AIP, one of our bases of operations, is actually in a now UMD owned building, and we are a UMD affiliate. So and many of the staff in our organization are alums of the university, specifically of the College of Information. So lots of great connections, and hopeful that this talk can be just a kickoff to some more future exploration and connections going forward. So my talk today here, From Collections to Connections, libraries and archives as laboratories for belonging-centered archival futures. The concept of cafe as being about archival futures, I think, is really inspiring. It connects with a few different points, so I'll get into that as we go. But I really think the center of what we're getting at is that there's tremendous power to think about the way that the collections of cultural heritage organizations can connect with and build belonging. And that's something that cuts across a few different areas of work and background I've got. So this is just a brief roadmap for what I'm going to talk about today. So I'm going to start out just introducing myself a little more, giving a little more context on some things I've worked on. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about two of the books, which were mentioned in my intro a little bit, my digital preservation book and After Disruption, really that sets a stage for sort of some themes that come through in my work. And I think I'd stress is that while I have been teaching and publishing and writing, really my career has been in as someone who worked 9 to 5 in libraries, archives, museums, contexts, working on advancing missions. And so in that context, I really have continually tried to think about my work as being about working with teams to develop approaches to really use the work of libraries and archives as laboratories for developing and thinking about the future. So that is a part of the theme we'll get into. Then I'll talk a bit about one context where this connection to collections point of view comes together, which is some virtual volunteer engagement work that I helped support at the Library of Congress. I'll pivot into giving a little bit of background and context about what this AIP research thing is that we're working on here, and then talk a bit about some specific ways that this idea of centering belonging and work with collections is central to what we're doing at AIP. So for some background on me, I'm a librarian, archivist, social scientist, and historian. I have a background in the history of science, federal funding, digital preservation, and curation. Most recently, as noted, I was the director of digital services at the Library of Congress, but I've also had a decade of experience as a public historian in residence at American University and as a lecturer teaching digital preservation and curation courses at the University of Maryland. My PhD is actually from a college of education at George Mason University. So I have in social science research methods. So that's sort of where my roots are, but that sort of cuts across the various areas. And here are a few pictures illustrating work I'm particularly proud of from some of my career. The first picture is me showing and describing Carl Sagan's college notebooks to Bill Nye at an event at the Library of Congress, where we were launching an online exhibition of Carl Sagan's papers that I curated. In the upper right is me working with the team of program officers I supported at the Institute of Museum and Library Services as we had an event on the National Digital Platform Initiative that I led there, which funded 100 projects at a total investment of over $30 million in U.S. funds. And the last picture is was on a Fulbright at the National Library of Kosovo, helping them develop their digital strategy in 2022, specifically looking a lot at how their oral history programs could connect and digitization efforts could work to advance their goals around UN Sustainable Development Goals. So that's a little context and background on me. I'm now going to talk a little bit about the theory and craft of digital preservation and After Disruption, and the ways they kind of chart a journey from thinking about collections and increasingly getting into this area of connections. So theory and craft of digital preservation came out in 2018, and After Disruption just earlier this year. But the real genesis of the theory and craft of digital preservation is the course I taught on digital preservation in fall of 2016 at the University of Maryland, where I wasn't really happy with any of the textbooks that were out at that point in time. And so building the syllabus really turned into the basis of developing that book. And I'm also delighted with some of the kinds of work that students did as a result of that. So when I taught the class in 2016 and in 2018, I worked with the Association of State and Local Historical Societies to identify and pair students with organizations that had projects for them to work in. It's a really small cultural heritage organizations. The two digital preservation plans here from College Park Aviation Museum and the Old Trails Museum in Winslow, Arizona came out of that. And the work that Tracy and Gwendolyn as students in that class did is really outstanding. But I think it really also helps to draw out the way that particularly smaller organizations can really benefit a lot from partnering with students to learn about this work, really building ways to ensure access to collections. So those classroom experiences really became the basis of writing the digital preservation book. And the digital preservation book opens with a consideration of a sort of duality and hype problem that we have around digital information. That on the one hand, articles like this from Inc. magazine come up constantly, right? That what we put online is forever and we need a reminder, kind of thing that I tend to think is written to scare young people about thinking about very, very deliberate about what you do or don't put online. But then right after that, you can get whiplash and see something like this, that we're being warned of a digital dark age where we might lose everything. And so it seems at once like we might lose everything, and at the same time that we might have everything sticking around, haunting us forever. And that anxiety that comes from that is really where the genesis of the book came from. And so here's the table of contents, which is just a way to talk through some of the structure of where the book went. And the main reason I've got this up here for us today is to draw out that the main intervention I tried to have with the book is to sort of do a reset about thinking about theory and craft of digital preservation. And the way that we approach digital preservation is something we've now been doing in cultural heritage organizations for half a century. But that we need to connect up different traditions, and that ultimately we're talking about access in the future. And so the reason I'm sharing this to kind of set things up today is that the end of the book really ends up being the jumping off point for the second book. And so briefly, here's some nice things people have said about the book. I think a fun thing here is that in some sense, this is David Ferriero from the former archivist of the United States, and Kyle, who wrote a great review of the book in American Archivist, sort of saying the same thing, but in opposite ways, that part of the book is about talking about us being part of a tradition of memory keepers, and at the same time, I'm attempting to intervene in a lot of discussions about digital preservation, become a little more pragmatic and practical and less sort of focused on really complex metadata schemas or charts and those kinds of things. But some of those meaningful things that I've gotten from the book are some of the Goodreads reviews. So there's a bunch of great Goodreads reviews up, but I'll just put this one up here to share with folks. So Christy, a solo archivist, really ends up finding, and I hear this from a number of people, finding themselves feeling a little less alone by having some of digital preservation demystified. But then as she notes in the end, there's this whole sort of veering into questions about climate change and social justice. And we think really in the long term about digital preservation, we end up thinking about why collections matter, who they matter to, how we can connect people to those collections. And so that ends up being a big part there. And so that is sort of this pivot moment that came together between the last chapter of the digital preservation book, which is about tools for looking forward, and try and make the case that we really need to think like futurists if we're going to do digital preservation well, because we're thinking about access in the future. And on a basic level, that's things like, are people going to have computer mice when they're using, and keyboards when they're interfacing with computers? What's voice going to mean for just thinking about interfaces, right? Becomes an important thing as a futurist. When you really delve deeper into that, the biggest preservation threats that I think we face for digital culture, much more about what matters, the sort of investment and belief and valuing of cultural heritage institutions. So the sort of existential threats that we face across the board really are the biggest things when you start to think like a futurist. And that is what got me to work on After Disruption, the next book. And so the jumping off point for After Disruption for me was tied up in many ways with this comment from Rethinking Repair, which comes up in a lot of different discussions, but this idea that a lot of our discussions around innovation tend to not be grounded in things like a maintenance mindset, way of thinking about care and maintenance. So that really was the animating force for the most recent book. And so building on that idea that problems in digital preservation aren't primarily technical problems, it's really critical to deeply delve into ideologies that drive how technology and work are being designed in our society. And so the first half of After Disruption tries to diagnose a set of sort of bankrupt ideas about disruptive innovation, about data-driven decision-making, really ways that in many cases, and I've observed this in a number of organizations, were sort of somewhat facile versions of Silicon Valley style thinking, end up pushing out and crowding out the ability for people within cultural memory institutions to develop their own ways of thinking about creativity and the embrace of technology to advance our missions. So that's the first half of the book, and the second half brings together work in Afrofuturism, queer futurist scholarship, feminist philosophy, disability justice, STS work, work on indigenous and majority world historians and scientists, and making the case for the centrality of maintenance, care, and repair as a rich interrelated set of frameworks for building a better future for libraries and museums. The book is Libraries, Archives, and Museums. The book is open access, so if you're curious, you can download the PDF from the University of Michigan's website, University of Michigan Press website, and explore it more. I get into a lot of different scholarship, but I'm particularly enamored with, and I'm sure many here as well will be enamored with, Michelle Caswell's work. Here, I'm just putting up a big quote from Seeing Yourself in History, which is going to serve as sort of the pivot here to move into the applied parts of this presentation. I'm talking about belonging at the center of work with collections. But I think it's just worth underscoring and hitting home that in this question about relevance of libraries, archives, and museums, which I think is a big part of our sustainability, our future for these institutions, is very much tied up in questions of audience and community about belonging. And so in that vein, the sort of symbolic annihilation faced by marginalized communities and discussions about whose history counts or doesn't, really, I think, is at the heart of this question about building better institutions, building relevant institutions, and connecting them to communities. And so that'll be the jumping off kind of theory side for what I'll now talk about in some practical examples. So as mentioned, I was at the Library of Congress for a decade, with an interlude where I was at the Institute of Museum and Library Services, the middle. But one of the responsibilities I had there was working on supporting the crowdsourcing platform, better thought of as virtual volunteer engagement. And I was really grateful to have the chance in my first stint at the Library of Congress to do some work thinking and theorizing about cultural heritage and crowdsourcing. And to underscore a point that likely many of you are familiar with, particularly if you've had the chance to talk with Victoria, who was really instrumental in a lot of the work that on crowdsourcing that happened at the Library of Congress. Volunteer engagement ends up being a much better way to think about it, in that generally cultural heritage crowdsourcing problems don't involve crowds, and at their best are not about outsourcing. They are about engaging with sort of dedicated enthusiast and expert communities who might be amateur, but in many cases are also retirees or students. And they're also not about sourcing, they're about sort of providing meaningful opportunities to connect with collections. And that was a point that I made early on, relatively, in the conversation about this about a decade ago, in Digital Cultural Heritage in the Crowd, and Curator, the Museum Journal. But then I was delighted to see how central that became in the work By the People that the Library of Congress launched. And so if you're unfamiliar, By the People is anyone can go to crowd.loc.gov and jump in and get started transcribing pages or reviewing them. It's a really vibrant, active community now of more than 40,000 volunteers who signed up and have transcribed more than 850,000 pages of material. I should stress that Kate Zward, my former boss at LC, was the person who really spearheaded this effort, and then the team of staff who came together to develop the software and run it, the community managers, the team who's continuing to work on it, they really get all the credit for this, but I'm happy to have had a little bit of time where I helped kind of steward and support the project. And one of the things we worked on there, which I'll share a little bit, is a survey that we did of our members, our volunteers, and I think draws out some of the points about belonging that are really powerful here. So I'll hit on these, and then I'm going to pivot into talking about some AIP things. So the first thing I'll share is when we ask people, what their primary motivation was, why they were motivated to participate in by the people. I think the thing that's worth noting is pretty far down the list is meeting the goals, the transcription goals. At the top are things like improve access, give back to the public good. They're interested in the history topics. They're interested in learning. Really, those are the things that kind of rack up way at the top on the agree things, the things people are really invested in by the people. And if you go further into the stories behind those and the narratives, these are some examples of some of those motivation discussions for improving access. You've got things like, it's a hobby I have where I know I'm making a difference. I'm helping make history more accessible. It's something meaningful I can do on my own schedule. I feel like I'm sort of part of something bigger, right? And we're thinking about belonging as a process that they're finding they're part of something bigger, contributing to the nation's historical resources. By the people they're serving, I'm serving my country in a fun and educational way. It's satisfying to know that my work will allow future generations to learn about history and make it more accessible. Go through a few different examples here. This one gets at some of these multiple reinforcing things. Like, I originally learned about this program on TikTok and saw it as a cool opportunity to offer my time to something good and learn a little bit about history. It's fun to do, and I get a few of my friends to sign up as well. People love the chance to get a deeper look into history, explore primary sources, but also getting to help preserve it by transcribing. So some of those points, and then gotta find my cursor, 1 second. As another one, here are some reflections on the impact that the program has had on people. The idea that they've learned a great deal about American history, or helping others being able to learn and learning at the same time, feeling like they're doing something worthwhile. There's this really interesting mix together of making a contribution, right? Wanting a way to contribute to a community, and then also having sort of personal reflections and learning goals at the same time. And so this is all in a paper that we've got coming out. We've got under review in a journal that'll come out in the future, but I like showing it because I think it really does hit home this point about crowdsourcing as something that's the most meaningful work of this. You know, on some level, the 850,000 transcribed pages are great, but really the 40,000 people who've had this chance to have this really in-depth relationship with history, with the collections, it's actually far more significant. Now, you can't have that engagement without the significance of offering that opportunity for people to connect and participate. But if you haven't played around with it before, I'd encourage everyone to check it out. And the other thing I'd underscore with it is that the discussion forums are really a vibrant place where you see online community happening, where people are helping each other, learning together. It's pretty exciting. So to shift gears a little bit, I'm now going to give some context on sort of the shift I made over to AIP, and then talk a little bit about how we're thinking about the strategy for our research institute connecting with the function of the strategy of our research institute connecting with the functions around library collections and belonging that I've been discussing. So starting in February, I took a new job as the chief research officer. I'm the first person to have this job here. And the thing that really excited me about this was I'd had 13 years in federal service, but was the chance to really help bring something together in a new way. My undergrad degree is actually in history and the history of science. So I have a long-standing passion about the history of physics and the physical sciences. So the idea of being able to dive in and work with a team on these issues was really exciting to me. So this is just a brief notion of what AIP research is. So we bring together decades of research capabilities, focusing on cultivating and empowering positive change in the physical sciences. And so the point to note here is it's social scientists, sociologists, statisticians, historians, archivists, librarians, all working together in many ways around collections, and I'll draw that out a little bit more too, but with the intention of empowering positive change in the physical sciences. That's the why of what we're doing. And I'll get a little more specific about what that looks like in a minute too. But this is actually really what AIP research is. It's 24 of us, as I mentioned, historians, sociologists, librarian archivists, many of whom you may notice some familiar faces here. There's a lot of alums from UMD, particularly from the high school. But here you can see us sort of all together. This is the team that comes together to do this work. And so historically, these groups, the history and policy folks, the statistical research folks, and the library and archives folks, have thought about their work in terms of the how of the work they do. And we're increasingly thinking collectively across our organization about the sort of capacities that we have and the why of what we do. And so our history team, for instance, does oral histories, and we've collected over 2,000 oral histories with physical scientists going back to the 1960s when our history programs launched. But those oral histories really are part of how we connect people, and we build collections. We sort of curate those collections, and we're also creating new content like our newsletters or reports, online resources that make that content useful and accessible. And so within that context, something like our library and archive services, everything from reference services to relationships with donors or hosting visitors to the collections we build and then enable the use of, that there's this whole sort of cycle across each of those areas. And so we're increasingly thinking about that goal of empowering change, positive change in the physical sciences, the idea of AIP research as this bridge between a physical science community. So AIP is a federation and an institute, and the federation is a collection of 10 different societies in the physical sciences. So our federation component is the American Astronomical Society or the American Association of Physicists in Medicine, or the Society of Rheology, which deals with fluid dynamics, 10 different member societies. We are the archival home, the repository home for 8 of the 10 of those societies. Organizational records, so that's a cornerstone of what we have in our collections, but we also do a lot to facilitate connection and exchange of the sort of more than 120,000 people that are members of all those societies. So we have these physical science communities. Physics Today is a publication that goes out to the members of all of those societies every month. We also work with the Society of Physics Students, which there's a great chapter of at UMD. But the Society of Physics Students is undergraduate students interested in physics and astronomy. And then FYI is our public policy newsletter. So those are all the things that really engage with physical science community. And the other end, the research team has these really great connections to our disciplinary communities. So within our history program, we've at multiple periods of time funded a early career research conference for historians of science. And so that moves around, but it's a way that we connect our work and our collections into the history community. Similarly, our librarians and archivists are very active in SAA or ALA or different groups around collections. And then our social scientists and our policy researchers in the same way. So this idea that we're mobilizing and connecting between those physical science communities and our disciplinary research communities is at the heart of our strategy. And I've mentioned that we're thinking increasingly about the how of the work, or more about the why of the work than the how, right? That's what we're getting to. And so in part of our work to develop the strategy in the first 6 months, we've really zeroed in on these 4 areas of focus that are cross-cutting, right? For policy research, for work in the library and archives, for work that's statistical research, for history, that all of those things connect back to these 4 thematic areas that we're supporting culture of inclusion and belonging in the physical sciences, that we're advancing equitable public policy in the physical sciences, we're ensuring records of 20th and 21st century science are preserved and used, and we're promoting vibrant career trajectories for physical science professionals. So you can take any one of our areas of work and connect them back to one of these 4 things, sort of a rudder for us and a way to communicate about what we work on. What's worth noting is that this is not sort of a radical shift for us. So here is Robert Oppenheimer speaking at the opening of the Niels Bohr Library and Archives, AIP's Library and Archives, in 1962 when it was in New York. And the sort of big quote here is his explanation about why a library and archives is so important to the physical sciences. And I think significantly, there is this center of belonging in here too, right? That this room, the library as an idea, serves as a hearth where serious students of the human predicament can come in the future So understand the discoveries in the sciences are themselves among the great epics, and that they're a tradition that will sort of find its home in this space. So I think that center thread of belonging is already there in sort of the founding moments of our history and library programs. And with that, I'm now going to pivot into giving just a few specific examples of what this idea looks like in practice. And then that's probably another 10 or 15 minutes. And then after that, I'm looking forward to having a lot of discussion time with all of you going on from there. So as a practical example, this is a 2 pages from our most recent newsletter issue for AIP's history newsletter, which you can download for free off our website, or you can subscribe to. We'll mail it to you a print copy or send you email versions of it when it comes out. But on the one side, you've got me introducing myself to our readers, and on the other side, Kai, who was our summer intern working with us from the Society of Physics students, introducing himself and talking about what he was going to work on in the summer. And so one of the things Kai did, he actually did a lot. He's pretty amazing. I'm blown away by what undergraduates are capable to do at this point. A lot more impressive than anything I'd have been able to do. But Kai wrote this post for our library blog Ex Libris Universum. It's called The Power of Oral Histories. And Kai makes the case about how important it is to work to diversify our oral history collection so that people can find belonging and connection. And so Kai actually did interviews with Dr. Jan Eldridge and Dr. K. Renee Horton. Both of those interviews are now part of our archives. And he explicitly went out to engage in them to help diversify our collection. It's a great contribution. These are going to, I'm sure, be really useful in the long run for historians of science. But what I really love about this example is if you're thinking about those themes I was just talking about vibrant career trajectories for these stories are part of career trajectories. At the same time, this experience is actually now part of Kai's career trajectory, right? He had this chance to help change history. And he's also very much centering work around belonging within our work with collections. So it's sort of a really powerful connection across a bunch of these areas and illustrates how, something that one might think of as just being about building up a storehouse or a collection, the process of actually building that collection can really center belonging. And I'd note that inviting stories has been a long-standing theme of things that we do within our collections. So what you're seeing here is Shakespeare Got It Wrong. It's not to be, it's to do. The Memoirs of a Geophysicist by Jack Oliver. This was written in 1998. And I've got a big block of text up. I've got a big block of text up on the screen here that's from the preface. But the reason I really like showing this is that you can see the autobiography was stimulated by a request from the Committee on the History of Geophysics of the American Geophysical Union and the Center for the History of Physics at the American Institute of Physics. Otherwise, I might not have attempted it. So the thing I think is really powerful with this is this autobiography really only exists because it was explicitly called for and invited, right? This is sort of calling in and saying, you've got a story, we want to hear it. It turns out in Jack Oliver's case, he was a hugely important figure in geophysics and specifically around plate tectonics. So he played a role in really validating some core ideas about plate tectonics. But we have in the Niels Bohr Library and Archives, at this point, something around 500 what we call manuscript biographies like this. In some cases, full memoirs or autobiographies. In other cases, sort of short biographical notes and things like that. But these really full biographies, as far as I can tell, there are 2 copies of this that exist. One that is with his papers and one that is at the Niels Bohr Library and Archives. And both of them will say that the reason they exist is because of this invitation. So I should mention too that along with great history of science content, Jack Oliver is also apparently a big fan of limericks, and so he ends every one of his chapters with one of these sets of limericks, which are now part of our collection, and are also there's a scanned copy of it online. So if you want to go through and read the rest of these limericks, you can. But I think the really neat personal nature of these relationships comes through in some of these materials. So I'll give a tour through a few more items. A Career in Crystallography by Elizabeth Moore is another one of these really powerful manuscript biographies. Again, as far as I know, there are 2 copies of this in libraries, and one of them is with us. Moore included a scan in there of all of her Girl Scout badges, which I think is just such an endearing and delightful thing within her story about being one of the first sort of a pioneer woman in studying geology at Radcliffe in the 40s, and then crystallography at MIT, working at companies like Polaroid and IBM. Inside it, there's actually a bunch of different pictures, and so these ones I really love, in that they're 1948 issue from Mademoiselle. There's a cover story about jobs that in part also features her plan. So you see Elizabeth mentioned there under Jewels Every Day, where it talks about her as a crystal analyst who's going to get a PhD in crystallography. But here are a number of other pictures of her from her biography, a memoir, which we have again in our collections, but it's sort of really powerful in drawing together connections between optics, crystallography, the history of science in the 20th century. It's particularly compelling in that we don't have a lot of people's stories who work in industry. So someone like her who took the effort to record her story is really powerful. And then as one last example in these manuscript biographies, a really fun one we recently acquired is Stephen Dick's memoir, which this was a Born Digital acquisition gifted to us and then immediately made available online. So if you want, you can go to our digital repository and download the several hundred pages that is this volume. Dick worked as the historian at NASA, and so he had this amazing sort of career and history of connecting with different astronomers and aerospace engineers, et cetera, throughout his work, and that story is now preserved and available for anybody here. To continue that work forward, the next issue of Radiations, which is a magazine that goes out to members of Sigma Pi Sigma, which is the Physics and Astronomy Honor Society. We're recreating and reenacting that call that went out to Jack Oliver, but in a much more open way. So really calling people within the physical sciences communities to think of us as a home, a place where their stories can find resonance, and particularly for people whose stories might not otherwise be sort of covered in the broader themes, we're really focused on that as an area of focus. So we'll talk about a couple more examples of collections here briefly, and then we'll hopefully have a little bit of time for questions. So another story about how collections build these kinds of connections is the Ronald Menkins collection. Menkins is a prominent African-American physicist. When the American Physical Society, one of AIP's member societies, celebrated its centennial in 1999 in Atlanta, he developed posters documenting how African-Americans have participated in physics over time, the important role of African-American and Black physicists. He also served as the historian of the National Society of Black Physicists. It was just someone really passionate about the history of physics. So his collection that he created through that is now actually part of our collections, and is a really great, relatively short resource documenting what an underdocumented part of the history of the physical sciences. And so if you're curious, we do have an episode from a podcast we ran called Initial Conditions, a physics history podcast that delves in a big way into a bunch of his work and the collection. And there's also a second episode that is an interview with him. So it's a really great resource to help surface really important histories that had not been focused on nearly enough. And then on the other side, you can see a set of photos that come out of his collection that are part of our visual archive, which is known as the Emilio Segre Visual Archives. And that's worth mentioning and explaining a little bit of context on, because Segre, folks may or may not know, was a really important atomic scientist who worked on the Manhattan Project, an immigrant from Italy. He was also an amateur photographer. And so when he worked his way through his career, he also took massive amounts of photos, and that collection came to AIP along with a donation that helped kick off our visual archive collection. And so We now have more than 30,000 photos of physical scientists, and formal and some candid and shots as well. Here are some examples, all of them available online, or at least the majority of which are digitized. And we're thinking now about how to continue that, how to grow those donations. And so these two photos, this is two photos I took when I visited NIST for a tour of the kibble balance, and specifically of Doreen El-Haddad, explaining how this amazing and wondrous device works. It uses sort of fundamental constants to measure mass. And I can tell a whole story. That little foam green cube she's holding is actually a representation, a 3D model of space-time in the room, which is actually necessary to make the balance work. But in the interest of time, I won't talk too much about the story there. But the main point with this is that I'm gifting these photos that I took on my trip into the collection. And we're going to be inviting more and more people to do that as well, to build on what is really Segre's tradition of sharing and sort of gifting forward these photos that document all different parts of the physical sciences. So with that, I'm going to end with this slide, which is sort of a working draft of something I'm thinking about really what the Niels Bohr Library and Archives can and should mean to me and can mean to many other people. So as noted, this idea and the sort of core premise of the talk is that the library and archives can serve as a laboratory for developing belonging-centered archival futures. All the examples I've been talking about here, I think, are examples of what the research and action looks like in doing the work of belonging-centered archival futures. Second one here is a personal memorial to physical scientists that our book collection is mostly donations from physical scientists, so it's literally physical sciences, just books. But as noted, a lot of our situations too, where we've got these unpublished memoirs, we're really the home to the long-term home, preservation home for people's personal stories. And within that we can function as a cultivator of a legacy mindset among scientists, where an opportunity for scientists to step back and see themselves as a part of that great tradition Oppenheimer was talking about in 1962 when we opened the library. But there's also this opportunity for facilitating intergenerational, interdisciplinary dialogue between scientists, historians of science, and social scientists. I think Kai's story is a powerful example of that too. Someone coming in as an undergraduate student, making those connections with people in the field, and also connecting across, bridging history and the history of science. And then lastly, as a trusted source in an increasingly untrusting world, that this is a home and a sort of place, that hearth that Oppenheimer was talking about in the beginning. So those are my remarks and my comments. I'm delighted to have a chance to sort of hear from and discuss some things with all of you. The other thing I would note too is that the library is a public space. We're open to researchers. And so if you're interested, you can view our collections and materials, our finding aids, et cetera, our catalog online, and schedule a time to come visit or reach out. I'm just T. Owens, OWENS, at AIP.org, and I'm happy to connect with folks and help make our library vibrant and usable to anybody who's interested.
Bravo, round of applause. Thank you so much, Dr. Owens. What an interesting talk. I know we're having an interesting discussion starting now. As I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, we have started a new tradition of trying to hold space at the beginning of Q&A for student questions. I see one excellent question in the chat from one of our PhD students, Brittany. Others are welcome to start adding questions in the chat or raising a hand, and that includes everyone in the audience. But before I dive into the chat, I wanted to just give first dibs to the watch party we have here on campus at the University of Maryland for our students, our Student Archivists of Maryland group, from our MLIS students and others. And if you all have a question in the room and would like to ask it out loud or type it into the chat, we'll welcome that one first. And if not, I will dive in with Brittany's question in the chat here.
Hey, so I'm a big fan of teaching through historic experiments. I work at Air and Space right now and do that a little bit. So when you were mentioning how these digital preservationists now have to think like futurists and think about how people are going to access those records in the future, I was wondering if there's anything in your science archives that you wish scientists back then had thought, well, maybe it would be nice if people could recreate these results in the future. I'm sure they would be thinking more about scientists doing that, but is there anything now that you're trying to kind of bridge this gap and create a greater sense of belonging, maybe with students?
That's fine. The work that goes on with historians of science recreating historical experiments is absolutely fascinating. So I'm thrilled that that's a thing you're into and interested in, and it does surface a lot of interesting issues. We actually had, and if folks are curious, Larry Principe gave a talk recently through our Trimble lecture series. Who came down from Johns Hopkins to talk about some work in the history of alchemy that proved to actually have some really useful sort of chemistry understanding that came from very practical things he did in recreating alchemical experiments.
I watched it on YouTube.
Oh, good. You've already seen it.
Yeah.
So, now I'm just plugging it for everybody else. This is a great view. I'm not necessarily, I think that I would say is there's some really interesting work that's going on around reproducibility of science, which is increasingly, dependent on all kinds of software and technology. And so in some cases, people making copies of their entire virtual desktop machine or something at the moment they hit run on an experiment so you can replay it. And so I think within that space, the work that's going around on software preservation and software emulation, I think does fit in some interesting ways. But it's interesting too to a fun example that I have there too is there's I'm blanking on his name at the moment. I'm kicking myself about it. But one of the foundational figures in chaos theory and complexity theory was a meteorologist and mathematician. His papers are at the Library of Congress, and there's some really fun examples there where someone like mailed him a disk that says like hit run and put your variables in, and then you can sort of see the strange attractor effect play out. And so it is a simulation or experiment, but a lot of work went into getting the right equipment lined up or virtualizing that equipment to make it playable and reusable. So I think there is a lot of interesting parallels that'll come up that are almost like kinds of digital archaeology that people are going to need to do to enable use of collections. And good news, for us, at least at AIP, our collection as a library and archives is we're not sort of primary resources in the sort of research data space as much. So the future of sort of science museum collections, I think, is going to be rife with some really complicated things about interdependencies between hardware and software that will parallel a lot of what we've learned from the experimental recreations.
Cool, thank you.
So I will go ahead and read Brittany's question here in the chat. All others welcome to throw questions in the chat or raise your hand to be called upon. So Brittany asks, you talked about futurity early in your presentation and how it's linked to our values, i.e. what we value in and from the future. Can you expand on this and talk about how you apply this idea in practice, especially when working with upcoming archivists, librarians, historians, etc.?
Yeah, no, this is interesting. I think time in many ways is the biggest resource that we have. And so I think there's some really interesting work around sort of how we construct time and think of it and the extent to which we sort of obligated it in the future. But I do think that there's a really important sort of people-centered way of thinking about all work in organizations that's about making sure people have opportunities to learn and grow in their work. That's not sort of a resource consumption frame of working with people. And so I think a lot of it for me as a sort of a manager and an executive role really ends up focusing on relationship centered approaches to thinking about the work as opposed to extractive ones. And so I've got my own kind of checklist of just like, there are a lot of pulls that can kind of push us into thinking in terms of like a resource extraction framework for all kinds of things about relationships and interacting with each other. And it takes a lot of work to kind of recenter and connect that back in everyday work. But even within our own organization, I note that like we really have been working to implement ways to do sort of professional, personal goal setting as part of what we do and thinking about coaching and mentoring to support people in that sense. So Interestingly, that people-centered approach is really good for business too, because that's actually the way that people work best. So the sort of extractive frame for working with people is both ethically problematic and then actually not good business. So I think there's some interesting connections there. But I love that futurity question, and I would stress that I would. Some of the later chapters in my book get into this a lot. So I'd encourage folks to check out the PDF, which you get for free, of After Disruption of Future Cultural Memory.
Cool. There's another question in the chat, but I'm going to jump back to our watch party. I understand there's another question in the room first from another student, Dalton.
Yes. Hi, Trevor. First thing first, in Intro to Archives last semester, we actually had a reading that was from your book, Theory and Craft of Digital Preservation, first chapter. Extremely great break from the very dry academic reading. So I just wanted to thank you for giving us a reading that was very good and very straightforward, and I really appreciated it. My question is primarily, do you kind of experience a lot of like when you're kind of acquiring like, this information from scientists in like the, these different types of scientists with like difficulty with getting information either from like the actual contents and stories or from the people themselves? Because I know that there's a lot of different ways of people wanting to preserve their information and like that scientists and mathematicians all have a different idea of what information is needed. Do you have like a lot of conflict with that, or is it a very kind of simpatico situation, at least from your experience?
Yeah, and so the first thing I'd say is that the folks on the team that are historians and the librarians and archivists on the team will probably have much better, richer answers to this question since they work directly with people all the time. I can offer my observations, but Melanie and Will and the staffs on their teams would likely have much more nuanced responses. Also, I should say thank you so much for the kind words about the book. That makes me really happy. That was the goal, so I'm happy it's succeeding. When it comes to interacting with scientists, one of the things I note is that our historians really do have a deep body of knowledge about the subject matter and do some research and then come to and connect with the scientists sort of in trying to draw out their stories. And we do there's a lot of great practice around oral history and how to sort of work on rapport and those connections. And so they do a great job of getting in the weeds in ways that are really powerful to draw things out, but also still keeping things at a somewhat high level. But then along with that, a fair amount of the good news too is that we're mostly dealing with textual image works, these sorts of things that are pretty standard. So it's sort of like, here's some photos, great. Here's some, I wrote up a biography, here it is, it's a PDF. Less so really complex, sort of like visualizations or all the kind of stuff that gets really hard in terms of preservation issues. But that said, there's another element that comes into play is we have some personal papers from scientists and engineers, but that's we mostly end up a lot of Melanie, who runs the archives, she sort of helps connect physical scientists to the right home for their papers in many cases. There's sort of a matchmaking service, like we tend to be known in some ways among physical scientists in a bigger way than but it might be like, oh, I'm looking at your CV and your alma mater would probably be a great potential home for this. And sort of the connecting people with other organizations is itself kind of a service we end up mediating between that physical science community and then the broader libraries archives community.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Okay, over to Katie Gucher in the chat with the question, can you imagine a by the people at AIP? What would it look like? The best crowdsourcing projects I've seen expand and diversify access to fields that, like physics, require very specialized knowledges, skills, and advanced education. Can you imagine a project at AIP that would produce the sense of belonging that emerged in the by the people community?
Yeah, that's thank you for that question, Katie. And it's great to see you in the chat. So by the people, really, so the first thing is like 3 amazing community managers work full time supporting by the people, and then a huge IT infrastructure supports a lot of the work, and connects with the massiveness of the collections of the Library of Congress. So to start with, the sort of magicness of by the people is in some ways tied up with the collections of the Library of Congress and its fit with its audience. And so the interesting element with AIP is, as I was noting in my slides, our audience really isn't the general public. It is physical science communities, and that's students, retirees, it's sort of people, and it's a big community. But what's great is it is, because it's a more discrete space, we can do a better job of seeing how well we're connecting with it. And similarly, like, you know, a place like the Adler Planetarium, or, you know, a natural history museum is actually way better positioned to do broad reaching public work. But there's likely going to be things that we can partner in the future with some of those kinds of organizations that really leverage our connections into these expert communities, really from undergraduate students all the way through to retirees, and connecting them into communities. But not to say that I think there's a lot of lessons to learn from by the people that we'll bring into some of our work, but that because of the difference in our missions and our goals, it'll end up likely looking very different.
Wonderful. We have time for one last question, and one has just popped into the chat from Kyle. Hello, from the STSCI library. Apologies if I should know what that spells, what that stands for. One of the major issues I've come up against in libraries and archives as both an ancient historian and an MLIS student is accessibility. Do you have any projects at AIP that are focused on making these wonderful projects and resources more digestible to those outside of the field, but who could contribute to the work?
Yeah, so a thing I'd note there is that we do have, our historians have at many times at points worked on projects that can sort of reach a broader audience. They're openly available online, sort of online exhibit-like sorts of things. We'll likely do a lot more of that in the future. Again, our core audience really is going to continue to be the physical science community, but one of the things I noticed when you get an acoustician, right, someone who works in acoustics together with someone who works in optics, with someone who works in, you know, astrophysics, they've got a depth of knowledge about science to begin with, right? But the nuances in their field radically become something that they can't just talk to each other necessarily about the things at the cutting edges of their work. So one of the things that we do hope to do more with our history programs in the long run is support some accessible points of entry, sort of explainer kinds of things on some of these issues that connect with our collections. Or similarly, you know, the oral histories are amazing resources, but really like the situation where someone sits down and reads, in some cases, an 8-hour a transcript of an 8-hour oral history interview is a very specific use case with historians. And so getting some components of those out more usable and accessible. We've built at various points in time some teaching guides for K-12 teacher use of some of our materials. And the spirit of that, I think, is going to persist forward. But there is this interesting sort of connection around making material more sort of accessible in that sense.
Awesome. Well, we still have questions in the chat, and I'm happy to hang out for a moment, but we will end the official cafe speaker series talk here. Thank you so much, Trevor, for your time and for this wonderful presentation. Thank you all for joining us. We hope we'll see you at our upcoming talks. It's great. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
I believe we should make Katrina.
We had to end the chat. We had to end the talk before we got to the last question that was in the chat. But
I think I saw it. It was a specific question about an archive that has a rayon collection, right? A collection related to rayon. Is that the one?
so a question about attracting specialized researchers in a small mountain town with limited budget for digitization and no ability to host online collections. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think what a thing I'd offer too is just to say that if anybody does want to do follow-up questions on stuff, I'm just towen@aip.org, and it might be easiest to just go back and forth on some specific points on that one too. So happy to just connect with folks directly.
Awesome. Thank you again so much, Trevor. We'll be in touch to coordinate after the fact. I had my own questions for you, but I do hope and I take seriously the invitation to continue with collaboration with the university. So look forward to following up.
Yeah, I think Victoria had said had been notionally thinking about trying to find a time to meet up with folks for dinner or something since it ended up being virtual. So happy to do that at whatever time that works for y'all. And then also, I think we're thinking about doing some more open house kind of things with the library. And so when those come up, I'll be sure that we share some info on that with you guys
Please
too.
do. That would be awesome. Cool.